Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of the PokePopCast. I had a hard time deciding. I was either going to do the next episode covering the penalty guidelines, the next section of the penalty guidelines, or take some questions and answers from the internet of some topics that people wanted to discuss. And as it turned out, a hot topic right now is marked cards. And as it turns out, the next section of the penalty guidelines I was going to cover is also marked cards. So I'm going to do kind of a combination here. We're going to talk about the penalty guidelines marked cards and also talk about a recent ruling at the Houston regionals that players were somewhat upset about. And we'll talk about why the ruling was made the way it was, how it fits in with the guidelines, and we'll also cover all the other aspects of marked cards at the same time. What is a marked card? So the way that trading card games in general work, not just Pokemon, is the card is considered not just the card itself, but the entire way the card is presented, which includes the sleeve. So when a card is in sleeves, the sleeve is part of the card. So when we're talking about a marked card, in most cases we're talking about marked sleeves because most players are playing with sleeves on their cards. Now, marked cards are serious because of the potential for players to either know the placement of a specific card in their deck or the ability to help them get a specific card, and those of course are serious cases, and there's a range of cases all the way down to markings that are not patterned, not easy to take advantage of, and therefore we're not even necessarily going to penalize some random markings of wear and tear on cards. Before we get into the actual penalties here, let's talk about what happened. Now, first I'll say I was not a judge at Houston. I have not spoken to any of the judges at Houston. This information that I'm going to give out describing the situation is based on how it was described by the opponent of the player who got the penalty. So, bearing in mind this is one side of what happened, but given that it's the potential bad side, right? Because the opponent is potentially going to describe it in the worst light possible. Even given that description, I will 100% support how the judges and the deck checking team handled this. So, as it was described on one of the Facebook forums, I forget which one, a player noticed that his opponent had some cards that were matte and some, or there was a slightly different texture to different cards in the deck, and it apparently was a significant number of cards. So what had happened, it looks like the opponent had, when sleeving their deck, had taken a pile of sleeves, and some were from one source and some were from another source, and they looked very similar, but they were not identical. So some were a little more matte, some were a little more glossy. From what, if you were looking for it, you would notice the difference, but if you weren't necessarily looking for it, you wouldn't notice the difference because it had been a few rounds and a number of other opponents had not noticed this and brought it to judges' attention. So apparently, as reported by the opponent, the judge came over, looked at the deck, apparently determined, and I'm going to use apparently here a lot because this is based on on the opponent's report, apparently determined that there wasn't a pattern that he could detect from looking at the cards in play, and so he determined to have them continue the game, and after the game have the deck checked by the deck checkers. And after they checked the deck, they determined that there was no pattern to the sleeve issue, and therefore they had him re-sleeve the deck properly and issued him a minor penalty, which was, in the case of a Tier 2 tournament, a warning. Now, there was some uproar among players online where they felt that any marking of the decks was potentially abusable, which is true, but that therefore any marking deserved a game loss at least. And some were even calling for a disqualification. So we're going to use this example as we're going through the penalty guidelines here to determine why it was ruled the way it was and why it should have been ruled the way it was. So the first thing with marked cards is that, and the guidelines mention that any markings can potentially give an advantage. So if some, but the question is how big is that advantage? And it starts going into some examples of markings on, say, a couple of trainers, a Pokemon, some energy cards, and there's no pattern to that. So the likelihood of it being abusable is low. Can it be abused? Potentially, yes. Again, any marking can potentially be abused. So what we're looking at here is the likelihood, the potential, and the ease of that abuse happening. So if the markings are spread, the same marking is spread through different types of cards, there's no pattern to that, that's a low-level problem. Similarly, even it gives an example in the guidelines. Decks where sometimes the players will have sleeves from different packs, and they even have the same finish, but maybe there's a different length to the sleeve. Just a couple of millimeters difference can be detectable. And if it's determined that the cards in those sleeves, again, have no pattern to them, then it's not a huge penalty. It's a minor penalty. It's all about what the potential abuse is. It's almost impossible for players to have sleeves in perfect condition for the cards in their deck. There's almost always going to be some marking, some wrinkle, something that makes a slight difference in how one card looks from another. Sometimes judges get a little overzealous and they're looking for players to have perfectly pristine sleeves where every single card is perfectly identical. There's not a single dimple on any card. And as most people are aware, because you use sleeves, the likelihood of buying a pack of sleeves and the entire pack being pristine, perfect gem 10 mint quality is virtually nil. So it has to be done, the judging of it has to be done with reason. You can't basically disqualify every single person's deck because there are markings. Now, if all the cards have the same marking, all the sleeves have the same marking, great. If a significant number of them have the similar marking, you basically have to be reasonable about this, and not expect pristine mint cards. Okay. Now there are usually 3 levels of penalties for infractions in the penalty guidelines. Usually you have minor, which is a low level, low potential of abuse, mostly fixable, so it's going to be a minor penalty. Then you have major, which is there's some damage to the game due to the error, or there is a greater potential for abuse coming from this error, and so that has a stronger penalty. And then there is severe, normally, which has very large problem and quite often results in a game loss, but not disqualification. When you look at the penalty guidelines for marked cards, though, you'll see that there's minor, major, and that's it. There's no severe. The reason there's no severe is because if the problem rises to that level, then it's really indicative of cheating. And at that point, cheating automatically moves on to disqualification as the penalty, and it's handled in its own section. So if the marking is so egregious that there's no way that the player could not have been aware of it, or it's so obvious that there is a strong abusable pattern, easily abusable pattern, the indication there is then this was cheating, and it moves out of the marked cards penalty and into the cheating penalties. So let's look at minor. Now, the issue in Dallas was determined to be minor, and the reason for that is in the description here. This penalty should be used when marked cards exist, okay, so that the marked cards exist, but there is no discernible pattern to which cards are marked. Okay, now the judges determined, and the players arguing for higher penalties did not dispute this point, that there was no discernible pattern to the markings. The next section here, before we get into some examples, addresses the issue of why the game was allowed to continue. Okay, and basically it says here, marked cards or sleeves should be replaced as soon as possible without disrupting gameplay. Okay, so it's saying here that if it's determined, if it's in the judge's opinion that this is not going to rise to the level of patterned, marked cards patterned, or cheating, then not to disrupt the gameplay. And so the judge followed that guideline. Now, players may not like that guideline, but where that comes from is that the penalty is going to be a caution or a warning. By it not having a pattern, that means that the potential for abuse is very low. If the potential for abuse is very low, then there's low probability of damage to the game happening, and so they're allowing the game to continue. The alternative of making them re-sleeve right then and there is that pretty much that game, it's impossible to do that without disrupting the game state to the point where you're probably going to either have to play a new game, or this game is now game loss, and you weren't issuing a game loss penalty, so it doesn't make sense to effectively create a game loss situation by causing a re-sleeve in the middle of the game. So that's the reasoning for that. It gives some examples here of marked cards that fall into the minor category. Now, before we determine whether something's minor or major, let's talk about the types of things that can create a marked card situation. You can have a marked card situation because there's a difference in sleeves, right? So you can either have the situation you had in Dallas where there's a different gloss to the backs of some sleeves. Another example they give in the guidelines is the length of the sleeve is slightly different. Some sleeves are a couple of millimeters different length than some of the other sleeves. They could be, some cards are double sleeved and other ones aren't, so now there's a different thickness to the sleeves. There's the issue of wear and tear. A lot of players were very dismissive of this, but I hate to tell you, if you're not keeping an eye on your opponent's cards that have wear and tear on them, if the wear and tear is significant cards, that's actually the category that I've seen the most disqualifications for cheating, is cards marked with wear and tear. Namely bent corners, a specific ding or wrinkle in a card that has a pattern to it where only specific cards, or mostly specific cards, have that pattern to it, whereas other cards don't. Or a very significant card, which is a one of in the deck, has a major flaw in that sleeve, and none of the other sleeves do. If players are, or judges are, ignoring that type of marking, that's allowing a player to, who has a deck that has, maybe they didn't create the sleeves with those issues, but they can certainly take advantage of it by positioning certain cards in sleeves that have those markings on it. So the difference between wear and tear versus actual different sleeves isn't all that great. They still, both of them can give potential advantage. And some players brought up the situation that, throughout the tournament, throughout the games, wear and tear on the cards is going to vary. And that's true. But that type of wear and tear is going to show up on most of the cards. Worn edges, that kind of thing. And you're not going to get a patterned problem where specific cards have that wear and other cards don't. Speaking of that, if you have to change out cards, if you have to change out sleeves, be very careful about putting in fresh, brand new sleeves into a deck where all the other sleeves are worn. So let's say you have to replace 4 sleeves because they split somewhere or whatever, they got significantly damaged, and you're putting 4 new sleeves on, and all the other sleeves have been played quite a bit. Those 4 pristine sleeves are going to stand out from all the other sleeves. If you put those 4 sleeves on your 4 VS Seekers, you've created a patterned mark card situation, which potentially could look like cheating, right? Because they're very significant cards and they're only 4, So just be aware that wear and tear on sleeves versus cards that don't have wear and tear on the sleeves can and will cause a marked situation that could lead to serious penalties. Now, the examples they give here are cards with thumbnail marks, but the cards that have the thumbnail marks are different types of cards. They give standard wear and tear in different areas, and another example where hollow versions of some cards have a bend to them. So those are your different types of issues that you'll see, right? So you got bendiness of cards, marks on the sleeves, different types of sleeves, and general wear and tear. All of those can potentially be issues. Now, what makes them minor versus major? Pattern, pattern, pattern. Let's go over, for players, how judges are looking at cards, at sleeves, to determine if there's a pattern. Generally, judges will look at the backs of the cards. Faces don't matter for this, right? We're only looking at the backs of cards. They might square up the cards to then look and see, are there any cards that have a different length? So that's step one. Step two, they'll go through the cards and look for wear and tear or any kind of markings on the cards. As they're going through the cards looking for the wear and tear for the markings, if they see anything similar, they'll put them in one pile of things that are similar. And this is all face down. They'll look for, are the sleeves have the same condition to them, same sheen, same finish. What this, marking in the upper corners going here, marking in the lower rights going there, and you're creating piles of cards that have different markings. They'll place the deck down and look to see if there's a bending. If there's a bending to some of the cards, you'll see some gaps in the deck, and those are going to be areas of concern because it's very easy to cut to a bent card. So once they've determined that there are some cards that are different than other cards, and they've sorted out ones that have similar markings and put them together, they will then turn them over and look at those cards and see, how are those cards the same? Are they all search cards that will help someone get a Pokemon? Are they the Pokemon that's really hard to get and a couple of search cards? Are they double colorless energies? Is there any grouping, is there any pattern to the grouping so that if they need a particular kind of resource, that group of cards will help them get that resource? So that's what they're looking for when they're looking for a pattern. So the same kind of error can either be minor or major, depending only on whether there's a pattern. If there's markings on cards, that could either be minor or major, depending on how those cards match up in forming a pattern. Are they different sleeves? It's either minor or major based on, is there a pattern? It all comes down to a pattern. Now, one card can be a pattern. If you have one marking on one card and it's a critical card that marking is on, that's a pattern, right? In expanded computer search, there's one in the deck. There's a mark on that card. Well, that's a pattern. It makes it very easy to find that card. And it's a critical card that can get you anything you need in the deck. Now, anytime you find a pattern, the judge needs to determine, was this pattern on purpose or potentially or accidental? And that's not the easiest call to make. The assumption with most penalties is that the player did not intentionally cause this error. Where the pattern becomes so egregious, either the pattern becomes so egregious that it becomes hard or impossible to believe that it was done accidentally. So I'll give you some examples. There's been cases where all sleeves were pristine in a deck, except for 4 that had a very distinct bend in the top corner. Turn them over. Those were 4 rare candies. That player got disqualified. Now, in the case of the sleeves that were ruled in Houston, again, have not discussed this with the judges that were there, but as described by the opponent, there were a number of cards. No pattern was detected, and so therefore the judges followed the guidelines and called that minor. Now, should it have been escalated? There's a potential for that. Players were basically feeling that, as I said before, any potential for abuse should be treated as major or severe in the case of cheating. There is no severe in this, so you're either treating it as major or you're calling it cheating. Here's the thing. almost anything out of the ordinary can be taken advantage of. The question is, how likely is it that that was being taken advantage of? How easy was it for it to be taken advantage of? In this particular case, if there was a large number of random cards that had the same sleeve on it, in order to take advantage of it, the player would have to memorize what sleeve was on every single card in their deck. And remember, no pattern, so it's not like 2 double colorless had it and 2 double colorless didn't have it, 2 of this Pokemon had it and 2 of that Pokemon didn't have it. That's a pattern now because you've got 2 and 2. So this is no pattern. And with no pattern, in order to take advantage of it, you're basically expecting the player to have memorized a lot of details about 60 card sleeves and an opportunity for that to come up where, using the double colorless example, they have 3 of the double colors either used or in play, so therefore they know that the 4th one is in a glossy sleeve. It's theoretically possible, but we don't issue penalties based on theoretical possibilities. We base them on the likelihood of abuse, and the likelihood of abuse here is low. And that's why the guidelines talk about no pattern being a minor. Those are the guidelines. That's what judges need to follow. That's what judges will follow. I'm all for going above and beyond or outside the guidelines when needed, but you need to have a strong reason to do that, and in this case there's not a strong reason to do that. So the guidelines should be followed in 99% of the cases. The guidelines were followed in this case. They made the right call in Houston. Summarizing for judges, getting back out of the example from Houston, when you're looking at mark cards, I've gone over some of the things you're looking for. You're looking for markings on the card. You're looking for different types of sleeves. You're looking for different lengths of sleeves. You're looking for patterns of things that go together. So, number one, if the markings are on all the cards or most of the cards, normal wear and tear, in most cases, you're not even going to call a penalty on that. That's your normal wear and tear of sleeves. And you cannot expect pristine Gem Mint 10 sleeves, right? So you're looking for more distinctive markings. If you find distinctive markings, then the question is, are there patterns or not? If you're not finding a pattern, and the patterns you're looking for are groups of cards that work together, or single cards with distinctive individual markings that are important cards. If there's a single card that has a distinctive mark on it, but it's a basic energy, 1 out of 12 basic energies, I'm not going to call that as a major penalty, right? If it's on their one computer search, if it's on their one Hoopa EX, whatever they might have that's a one of in the deck, or a critical card in the deck, then that may lead to an escalation in the penalty. But you're looking for patterns. If you're finding patterns, you're escalating. If you're not finding patterns, you're at minor. So now you found a pattern. Is it purposeful or not? If this is, the likelihood of this was that it was done on purpose, then you need to look at escalating up to cheating. If the evidence is not there to make that call, and again it's a serious call, so you need serious evidence, then you're a major where you're giving a game loss, or in a tier 1 event a multi-prize penalty. Bear in mind, if you're seeing the same thing multiple times from the same player, that increases your likelihood that you're going up to cheating, because you should not be seeing this multiple times from the same player. If you're seeing it multiple times from the same player, then you're finding an overall pattern to behavior, and that really leads you toward the cheating determination. Okay, so that's this section of the penalty guidelines. It's a serious section of the penalty guidelines. This is where players can have their tournament lost, basically, if they have a game loss issued. And I want judges to be aware that it's serious, but be able to make that call. And again, as we've said in previous episodes, you're not doing it to the player. The player's actions of either not having their deck done properly or purposefully doing something bad to their deck has caused the penalty to occur. So, but be reasonable, right? So normal wear and tear, where it's on the majority of the cards, you're not even issuing penalty for that, because that's all the cards are in the same condition, right? So that there's no, every card has a mark on it, but if they all have the same mark on it, they're not marked cards. Marked cards with no pattern, minor. Marked cards with a pattern, major. Investigate whether you need to escalate up to cheating. Okay, and we'll cover some more cheating when we talk about that portion of the guidelines. I hope that cleared some things up for players on what judges are looking at and how they're looking at these things. And hope to see you